Welcome to Morning Mantras and Pajama Praise. I am so excited this morning, so full of joy because I've been working on this project. And this project is this workbook. It is Living Women of the Bible. It is a celebratory reflection reminding um, women who were brought here on slave ships or thrown in slavery while here, that they are worthy of adoration. It is for those of us who inadvertently endured 400 plus years of captivity, perhaps Jim Crow, segregation, going through the civil rights era, continued police brutality. I know that's not all that we are, but a lot of times, um, I'll just speak from my experience. Growing up in the integrated South, reluctantly integrated South. I hope this is recording. I remember in the books, right, in the public school books, the only thing that we learned about ourselves was maybe a paragraph, and it would start with slavery. And in I went to predominantly white churches growing up, and I learned about a spiritual self there. But the glaring missing piece was a piece that aligned with my experiences and the celebrations and the toils that my parents and my family members were living. Those things weren't addressed unless you were steeped in a community of rich history or you had access to those texts. So when I graduated, I began to text and seek out those communities, which brought a lot of solace. But then there was my separate spiritual self. There was my separate ability to access ancient wisdom. Where does that go? So my hope is to bridge and mine the wisdom of those experiences so that if we are around in 40 years, I could pass that wisdom to my daughter, that she knows more than just a slave history, a history of America full of toil, but that she understands the foundation of how the women in this country have moved themselves from a slave reality into the reality that I live today. So, in my hand, I have two workbooks. A workbook that my mother, who was born into the Jim Crow South, filled out, and a workbook from my grandmother, who is 93. Okay. And then I have a workbook filled out from my mentor and representation of the divine male in my life, um, about his father and his experiences with his father, who was born in 1911. So I say this because in my hand, right, I'm holding golden nuggets of wisdom, of a unique experience of America. And instead of looking on that history with shame or guilt, because most of that history isn't written down, I want to repeat that. Most of the history that was experienced um, by, um, and I'll just stick with my focus. It was men and women, of course, but I'm talking specifically about the matrilineal line, the line that created the workforce, has not been written down. I say that because if you read a book, oftentimes um, the authors were not of the same community. When I was in college, I majored in anthropology, and in my participation observation mode, at the time I was doing anthropology, it was not a lot of brown skinned people doing that work. And I watched how mainstream America would go into the communities and they would interpret this information. And I also watched how um, the community themselves would not be forthright and vulnerable because where their information was going. So, a lot of what you're reading isn't necessarily the truth of the community. And I recognize this as I compare the published stories to my parents' stories. When we tell our own stories, it's a bit different. And oftentimes, it's still edited because the gold nuggets of wisdom may be mired underneath shame and guilt of those experiences. So even as my mother was getting the stories from her 93-year-old mother who is steeped in Alzheimer's, she said she showed up for this. I'm so excited, praise God. She said she showed up for this, and I haven't read yet. She said, but there were some questions that she was not going to be forthcoming with. She said there was about three that she was not going to be forthcoming with. So if that's three out of the 10, 15, then I'm okay, right? I'm okay. But that just let you know that unless we do our healing work, we may be losing out on the best part of our life and the transference of bliss, of the gold nuggets of wisdom that will enrich not only ourselves, but enrich the next generation. So I'm very, very excited to be steeped in the love of vulnerability that these warriors who have traversed, right, have culminated about 100 years of experience, have traversed this information on these pages so that the women who've lived through this um, are able to tell their tale from their mouths. And the exciting thing about this is my relationship with my mother has been very unique, and I can give you details later. But it's taken up to me healing my own journey, healing myself, my true self, integrating my fragmented pieces, coming to my mother in wholeness and in a house of love. She being open and healed enough to answer these questions. It's taken all of my 46 years to get this information from my mother, and my mother to be healed and whole enough to give this information. That's not rare for my community. It's not rare. It's not rare for the women in my community to have experienced such trauma that they can't even access it, okay? Because there's something that they have done to themselves psychologically to overcome, to raise their children, to go to work, right? We're talking about a society that was endemic of, because I'm 46, of makeup not being in our shades, right? In the 80s, of shampoos not being tailored to our experiences until the last 20 years into our hair texture. So the whole market, even in the capitalistic market where making money is the key, was not even geared towards us at all. We've been making concoctions and potions to get by, even the majority of my adult life, because it didn't exist. Our voice was not heard, even if you can make money off of us. That's how deep it's been. So I'm celebrating to have these conversations because it's a conversation that has been had in the start of many books. Shout out to Alice Walker, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Woman is Prose. There's a conversation she had in here with Coretta Scott King. And there's a passage here that says, but Coretta only states that she understands a black woman's reluctance to be involved in liberating herself when all black people are still not free. Of course, she says, and laughs with humor and exasperation, it is annoying to have men constantly saying things like, I know that must be a woman driver. She also believes that if women become irrevocably involved in social issues, they will find themselves powerful as activists and as women. She thinks that women will liberate themselves to the extent of their environment in the struggle for change and social justice. To me, this sounds very logical. This is Alice Walker. But I'm stuck with the suspicion that, as with Black people, there must be for women a new self given definition. I fear that many people, including many women, do not know, in fact, what woman is. We do, however, share a vast appreciation for the Black woman, liberated or not. I think we both realize that in the majority of Black women in the South, we have been seeing women whose souls have been liberated for generations. Okay. So we have a role to play, and we have done this individually. And I believe that this is um, the 2020 decade where we have been taking those steps. But I would like to contribute to more of a conversation of reflecting on what worked for us the past 160 years and what didn't. And in a parallel fashion, I would like any of those who consider themselves allies or even accomplices. And I say accomplices because even today, um, I think there was a law passed just a couple years ago that you couldn't wear locks to workspaces. So there's some things that naturally occur to us that is considered illegal. So you may be an accomplice in the act of something simple as our hair rights. But if you consider yourself an ally or accomplice of the community, I also realize that you have work to do. Also realize that you may have trauma that needs to be exposed and healed in your own families as you relate to our community. Because we have been lied on and you have been lied to. Again, let me say that. We have been lied on and you have been lied to about who we are. And about our relationship with one another. Because, oh, yes, we have a relationship with you, regardless of what community you are from. So, as I travel in this world, in these spaces, I just want to give a shout out for thanks and a shout out of praise for the nuggets of wisdom that drop by all communities, especially what funnels out of those who are indigenous to this slave history in this country. Our reflections, our celebrations, healing that pain body, and moving forward. So I look forward to making this workbook. It's in the draft phase, available to any and all who can relate to a sister, a Black woman who may have these questions for her mother. And I find that these questions are um, an agitative, instigative source for healing that needs to be happen before the boomer generation, my mom's generation, transitions off the earth. This is the last generation that has experienced segregated South and a lot of the history that I haven't. Let's grab hold of these nuggets of wisdom. Blessed be.